I never aspired to be a mob guy. But, I grew up with my father, who was a very high profile guy in the 60s. Once I got in, I said, hey, I'm going to be the best possible mob guy I could be. Here's how it's going to go. 75% me, 25% you. He comes to my house and he's got a box on his shoulder. It's a Saturday morning. He comes in and I said, what are we doing with all this meat? Are we having a party or something I don't know about? He said, hey, Chief, it ain't meat. Puts the box down. He opens it up. He said, this is the first 2 weeks taking the gas business. It was $320,000. I had over 350 gas stations, and we were servicing just about every branded and unbranded station that we can get a hold of. And we grew that 320 into 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 million a week. I got that call one night. I was concerned. I thought I could have walked into that room and not walked out again. The setup was not good. It was bad. I had about 15 agents surrounding me. And one guy looked at me, I'll never forget. He was an FBI agent. And he said, Michael, not this time. You became a star, and they were lining up to testify against you. Life is tough enough when you're doing the right thing and everything is good. When you get involved in criminal activity and you put more baggage on your shoulders to carry around, life gets so difficult. You got to play it straight at life, and that's the best possible shot that you have at having a decent life.
The world is changing. Inspiration is everywhere. It has never been so easy to connect, share, and bring people together. We're learning from others and finding the best in ourselves. Challenging our beliefs. Sharing our vulnerability. Overcoming our fears. Transforming ourselves so we can transform the world. How far can we go?
This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is...
This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Michael Franzese, the former American Mafia boss turned motivational speaker and author. As a captain of the feared Colombo crime family, you at one point were earning $10 million a week, making you the second highest earning mobster of all time behind Al Capone. In 1986, at age 35, Forbes listed you as one of the 50 most wealthy and powerful mafia bosses. Today, 48 of those are dead, one is serving life in prison, making you the only free man left. For your crimes, you served 6 years in federal prison, with 3 of those in solitary confinement. Today, you tour the world telling your story of the mafia as a warning to others of the dangers of living a life of crime. Michael, welcome to London Real.
Good to be here. Thank you.
It's great to have you here, Michael. I guess I wanted to start off and just tell you my brief story of my experience with, mafia and the mob. And it's kind of telling because it's got to do with the poster behind you. I grew up in San Diego, California, and in the 80s, I had never heard of the mob. I'd never heard of mafia because we just didn't have that history out there at that time. And it wasn't until I went to school in Boston and I woke up one morning at the fraternity house and I was all alone and I stuck in a copy of The Godfather, and that's the first time I was ever opened up to this life, and it just blew my mind, and I was just like, wow, I didn't know this existed. And 2 years later, I moved to New York City. This was 1993, and I was a trader on Wall Street. And one night, the guys took me out to Sparks Steakhouse, right? And I was just a junior, and they wanted to show me how large they lived, and the brokers took us out, the bookies took us out. And I still remember they brought out these wine glasses that were as big as my head and these steaks that were massive. And I was just this kid, in probably a bad suit and a bad tie. And at one point during the meal, they said, you know what happened out in front here? And I said, no, I don't know what happened. And they said, well, there was a murder out in front. And I was like, really? And they said, yeah, that's where we think John Gotti had Paul Castellano gunned down. And it was kind of my first introduction that there was this life. And Giuliani was in power then, and he was really trying to crack down on the city. But I kind of missed maybe the era that you were there, but I got the tail end of it. And I'm wondering, what does that remind you of when you think of those times? And the mid-'80s was kind of the time of transition wasn't it? Where kind of the old style was moving away and it was kind of not like it was going to be anymore. Is that what's kind of happening in the mid 80s?
Oh yeah, and growing up in San Diego, we didn't really have a presence out here at all. So maybe a little bit in LA, but certainly not down south. But yeah, 80s was certainly a transitional time. Brian, I always look at the golden era, the golden years of the mob, really from the 50s to the mid 80s. That's when everything was happening. We had control of, certainly New York City, many cities across the country had tremendous influence in the unions and even into the White House. But in the 80s, things started to change. They started to really use the racketeering laws effectively. Rudy Giuliani, you got to give him the credit or the blame, whatever side you're on, for really using that effectively and certainly made a big transition. The mid 80s was really the major transition of the mob in the United States.
Yeah, and you starred in this recent, series called Fear City on Netflix, which I recommend everyone watching. And it really got me back up to speed as what was happening kind of in the 80s in New York City with the concrete rackets and also this new technology that was this RICO statute and how the prosecutors kind of got educated on how to use it, and it completely changed the game. And I know, you've been quoted as saying when the guys on the street started fearing the government more than they were fearing our life, that's when everyone started flipping, and it was never the same again, was it?
No, it wasn't. And that was the big tool, the big weapon, the racketeering law, the Bail Reform Act. You didn't get bail if you were a danger to the community or a flight risk. And the Sentencing Reform Act, which gave huge sentences for crimes that before you didn't get that much time for. So what happened, they were locking a lot of people up and saying, hey, you're either going to cooperate with us or we're going to put you in jail under the RICO statute for the rest of your life. And, a lot of guys don't stand up under that, Brian. And that's when, informants really started to come forward. And of course, the use of technology, we just didn't keep up with their surveillance techniques. I mean, Brian, they had so much on tape, really the whole life was exposed through these secret tape recordings. I mean, in the John Gotti case, they had 2,000 hours of recordings. And I listened into some of them because we had the same attorney. They were listening to these tapes in the lawyer's room. And boy, they were devastating.
Wow. What I found fascinating about Fear City is that before that, they couldn't really touch you because, again, I call it technology, but due to the organization of the family structures, they could never really stick anything of note on anyone. And it always had that way of protecting the bosses. And they were very frustrated. Like you said, I guess from the 50s kind of to the mid 80s, they really couldn't do much about the five families. And it wasn't until the RICO statute and, like you said, married with the tech, and then those big sentences that everything started changing.
Yeah, it was very difficult. And remember this, a lot of guys went down for murder, for homicide. And prior to the RICO statute, murder was a state charge. It wasn't a federal charge unless you murdered a federal agent or you were on federal land. But under the RICO statute, murder became one of the predicate acts. So they were able to indict and convict people on murder in a federal system where they were never able to do that before. That was huge for them. So, I personally, I don't like the RICO law. I think it's unconstitutional, but of course I would have come to that. I was indicted twice under federal RICO statute and once under the state. So, I've had my share of RICO.
You want to hear something funny about RICO? So I was an interest rate derivatives trader for Bankers Trust, and it was on One Liberty Plaza, which was right next to the World Trade Center. And again, I'm 22 years old. I'm on the 33rd floor. I'm on a trading floor, and they're allowing me to trade futures and bonds. And like for me, it was like the time of my life. But funny enough, that our bank was later prosecuted and they threw the RICO Act at the bank because they had put a couple of different corporations into these fancy derivative trades. And the CFOs of those corporations, when the trades kind of tanked, put up their hands and saying, I got talked into this trade. And it happened with like Procter & Gamble and a couple other companies. And they said there was a system of them doing it to repeated corporate customers. And so they threw RICO at it, which tripled the damages. So in a weird way, Michael, they used that thing against even the banks.
Well, yeah, that's what happens whenever they create a law like this. I know the law was created by a fellow by Edward DeBakey, I think his name was, and it was created in 1970 specifically to go after the mob. And but you give the government a tool, and they kind of open it up, and they'll use it whenever they feel they can be effective with it. And so they started using the RICO law against any company that they said was a criminal enterprise. They created or made it a criminal enterprise, and then it would fall under the RICO statute.
There's a narrative in Fear City where you've got the Giulianis of the world and the lawmakers of the world saying, here are these mob guys. They're shaking down mom and pop businesses, these immigrants. They're really doing a lot of pain to the community. And then the other side is, I think, you guys, the wise guys that are saying, you know what, we actually make this place run better. We're better for business. We provide somewhat protection. We keep out the small-time criminals. Who's right?
Well, look, initially when, mob guys came here from Italy, I mean, they were preying on their own people in the neighborhoods. I mean, that's how this thing kind of started. They were extorting them, looking for protection money. It doesn't happen like that, on a widespread basis anymore. I mean, honestly, I never did that. If I went partners with somebody and they paid me, I gave them a service. It wasn't that we were just, leaning on them and extorting them. But it does happen to a degree with some of the smaller time guys. But, on a major level, I don't see it that way. Now, some people are going to disagree with me. But look, I had 25 years of my experience in that life. Others may have experienced it a little bit differently. But, I didn't see that as widespread as the government says we did it.
Okay. And what do you think of Giuliani when you see him on that, the same show you starred in? And you guys were playing a game. And I don't know if you ever watched the show The Wire. But it's kind of interesting because you got kind of the cops and the drug dealers, and they're almost playing a type of a game, of a cat and mouse game against each other. Like, what do you think of him and everything that happened in retrospect?
Well, listen, again, you got to give him the credit, I guess, for effectively using the RICO Act when he did. I will say a couple of things about him. I thought he was a great mayor in New York. He did a lot for the city. He really did clean it up, and I got to give him credit for that. And, it's funny because we recently were interviewed on a radio show here. He did it first. I did it second. And the radio host brought my name up to him, and he actually was pretty complimentary about it. So, maybe he's had a change of heart. But I always tease him. I say, hey, Rudy, I was the only one that beat you. He had me on a big racketeering case, and I was acquitted after a several-month trial. We were the only case that then ended up in acquittals. He convicted everybody else. So at least I got that on him, But look, he's you got to give him credit. I mean, he was a good prosecutor, and he was a good mayor. And actually, politically, we kind of find ourselves on the same side right now. So,
isn't that interesting? Those 50 guys that were published on that Forbes magazine. Knowing that you're basically the only one that's free, and the rest are dead or in prison or somewhat that. Is the ultimate message for people that are listening is that crime doesn't pay, no matter what happens in the short term, or what can we learn from that stat?
Brian, I preach this message to, I do a lot of prison, visits, and I work with a lot of juveniles, gangbangers, and I tell them straight out, you don't get away with criminal conduct in America anymore. Law enforcement is too sophisticated. They got too many weapons. There's too many informants on the street. And if you stay in criminal conduct, you're going down. I mean, that's it. Bottom line, you just don't get away with it anymore. And, for people to get involved in that life on a consistent basis, they're out of their mind. They're going to lose. There's no doubt about it.
I think there was this study that was done, and they took like a project in Chicago's South Side, and they ran the numbers for like the drug dealers and the kind of the juniors, and they ran on how much money did they actually make over the course of like 5 years. Putting in time that you're missing in prison, some of that time that, the big bosses are making more of the money. And they found that, the younger guys were actually making less than minimum wage. And yet they were sold this dream of this big time, cash flow. But the truth is, between the danger of death and prison and all the hierarchy, it wasn't a great decision to make to join that life.
No, not at all. What I tell people all the time, there's a myth out there, and I think the media created that, in that, all mob guys, all gang guys, they're rolling in dough. They're making a lot of money. But I always say this.
To continue watching the rest of the episode for free,
Visit our website, londonreal.tv, or click the link in the description below.